After the surrender of Imperial Japan in 1945, U.S. military units were deployed across the Pacific with specific orders to locate, secure, and manage prisoners of war. Among them were Japanese women who had served in auxiliary roles or had been conscripted. As laborers and civilian support staff in war zones often assigned to cook, carry, and clean for Japanese troops, some of these women found themselves caught in the sweeping arrests carried out by advancing American forces, and among those detained was a group of 24 women discovered in the remains of a collapsed field hospital in the outskirts of Luzon. They were weak, silent, and clearly afraid. When the American soldiers arrived, their clothing was in tatters, soaked in mud and blood, and their eyes avoided contact with anyone around them. These women had not held weapons, but they had worn military-issued armbands signifying non-combatant service, a detail that placed them in a gray zone under the terms of the Geneva Convention, which the U.S. forces were committed to uphold as best they could. The commanding officer on site, a young lieutenant from Nebraska named James Waller, had been in the Philippines for several months and had seen enough suffering to recognize the signs. Of neglect and malnutrition, the women were in poor shape. Several were running fevers, and one had collapsed upon being loaded onto the transport truck that would carry them to a temporary detainment camp just outside of Manila. Upon arrival, they were not placed in cells, but instead guided to a barracks building once used by Filipino army nurses. Before the Japanese occupation, Waller had ordered that the women be kept separate from male prisoners and guarded only by American female personnel or Filipino Red Cross nurses, where possible. However, the lack of infrastructure meant that some procedures had to be improvised, and one of the most immediate concerns was hygiene. The medical officer on duty, Captain Miriam Stokes, a former public health doctor from Chicago, noted that the women were wearing clothes heavily infested with lice and other parasites, which posed a serious health risk not only to themselves, but to everyone in the vicinity. In her report to command, she stated that immediate decontamination was necessary and recommended that the women be ordered to undress so that their garments could be burned and they could be medically evaluated before being issued new clothing, though this recommendation was standard. Under wartime procedures, it still presented a human and ethical challenge that would need to be handled delicately. Waller reviewed the protocol and approved the action, emphasizing that it be conducted with care and dignity. He instructed the team to explain through an interpreter what was happening and why, and to ensure the women understood that they were not being punished or humiliated, but that the measure was necessary for their health. The interpreter, a Japanese-American corporal named Henry Sato, approached the women with his voice low and his demeanor respectful. He explained that they would be given clean clothing and medical care, but their current garments had to be removed and destroyed to stop the spread of disease. Some of the women began to cry. Others sat motionless, staring at the floor, but eventually they complied slowly and with visible discomfort. The undressing was done in groups of 3 behind privacy screens set up using spare blankets and sheets, and each woman was given a wool blanket to wrap around herself. As soon as she stepped out of her old clothing, female nurses administered basic health checks, looking for signs of injury, fever, or infection. Many of the women had open sores on their arms and legs, and several were found to be suffering from severe dehydration. They were offered water and later small portions of broth and rice. One of the nurses, a volunteer named Dolores Ramirez, later wrote in her journal that she had never seen such quiet sorrow in her life and that the women seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 deaths in their silence. Once examined, the women were escorted one by one to a separate tent where a pile of freshly laundered uniforms awaited them. The uniforms were simple olive drab cotton dresses issued with undergarments, socks, and canvas shoes, and the women dressed without speaking, helping one another with buttons and ties where needed. One woman hesitated, holding the clean dress in her hands for several minutes before putting it on, as if unsure whether she was allowed to wear something that had not first been soaked in blood or dirt. The nurses observed these gestures in silence, understanding that something deeper was being cleansed than just skin. That night, the women slept on cots lined in rows beneath mosquito nets, in a room that had once been part of a school, their blankets pulled to their chins, despite the tropical heat. Many slept without moving, and others lay awake staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the sounds of insects and far-off trucks rolling through the hills. Waller made his rounds before midnight, pausing at the entrance to the barracks, and looking in. He saw still figures lying quietly. Under dim lights, a few turned their faces away when he passed. He did not enter, but nodded once to the nurse on duty and walked on his boots, clicking softly on the concrete. The next morning, the women were allowed to wash in makeshift showers set up outside behind tarps, and their reactions to the water were varied. Some stood still under the spray without moving. Others rubbed their arms and faces with both hands, as if trying to remove years of war from their skin. There was no talking, only the sound of running water and the calls of distant birds for breakfast. They were given more rice along with boiled eggs and tea, and they ate slowly, carefully, as if unsure whether it would be taken away again. Stokes continued her evaluations and noted that while several of the women showed signs of long-term trauma, there were no immediate medical emergencies beyond those already being treated. She recommended ongoing observation and limited interaction until their psychological state could be better assessed. Sato returned to speak with the group once more, letting them know through soft words that they were no longer in danger, and that while they would remain in custody for a time, they would be treated according to international standards and given the chance to write letters if they wished. A few nodded, others continued to look away. But something had changed in their posture, a slight loosening of the shoulders, a flicker of calm in their tired eyes. Waller wrote in his daily log that the women had complied without resistance and that the operation had been conducted with full adherence to humane standards. He closed his entry with a brief line, noting that none of the women had spoken a word except for one who had said thank you in perfect English before turning away and sitting down on her cot. The days following the arrival of the Japanese female prisoners of war in the camp were marked by a slow unfolding of routines and adjustments. The women remained quiet and reserved, but gradually began to respond to the care and efforts made by the U.S. forces to ensure their well-being. Lieutenant Waller made it a point to visit them regularly, to observe their condition and oversee that the strict orders given to treat them with dignity were being followed by all personnel involved. Captain Stokes worked tirelessly to monitor their health and began planning for longer-term care arrangements, including nutritional support and mental health evaluations. The camp itself was a sprawling complex of tents and makeshift buildings situated on a former training ground, surrounded by thick jungle and guarded by armed sentries. The atmosphere was tense but also pragmatic. There was little room for sympathy amidst the daily grind of managing hundreds of prisoners, but the female POWs were seen as special cases, their vulnerability obvious, and their past roles in the conflict both ambiguous and complex, meaning that many soldiers were unsure how to treat them. Some were wary, suspicious, or simply indifferent, but others showed unexpected kindness, sharing small gifts like cigarettes or cans of fruit when they could. One of the interpreters, Corporal Sato, became a vital bridge between the women and their American caretakers. His own background as a Japanese American who had faced discrimination during the war gave him a unique perspective. He spent hours sitting with the women, explaining rules, answering questions, and simply listening to their stories through broken exchanges of words, gestures, and written characters on scraps of paper. One woman named Hana, whose name was among the few they could confirm had been a nurse during the war, began to confide, slowly describing the desperate conditions in the hospital where they had worked, how they had cared for wounded soldiers, often without enough medicine or food. Despite the language barriers, the women began to establish a fragile sense of trust, especially as their physical needs were met. The new clothing issued to them was cleaner and more comfortable than anything they had worn in months, and the access to showers and regular meals brought visible improvements to their health. Many started to regain weight, and the pallor of illness slowly lifted from their faces, though their eyes remained wary and often haunted by memories of bombardments, executions, forced marches, and starvation. The camp command recognized that the women could not remain indefinitely in the cramped and austere environment, and efforts were underway to transfer them to a larger facility in Manila where specialized care could be provided. But until that time, the daily life in the camp followed a pattern of medical checks, meals, rest, and supervised activities aimed at maintaining hygiene and preventing outbreaks of disease. The nurses introduced light exercise and encouraged the women to speak to one another as a form of therapy. Despite their exhaustion and trauma, some began to share small moments of camaraderie, smiling briefly and helping each other with tasks such as sewing or mending. Torn clothes. One afternoon, a rare event occurred when a group of reporters accompanied by U.S. officers were allowed to visit the camp. The intention was to document the humane treatment of prisoners and to counter rumors that mistreatment had taken place. The women were gathered and dressed in their new uniforms and carefully positioned for photographs. Many looked uncomfortable, with the attention their faces betraying a mixture of fear and resignation. However, a few, including Hana and another woman named Keiko, held their heads high and met the cameras with a quiet dignity that left an impression on those present. Outside the camp, the war was officially over, but the world remained unstable. The occupation of Japan had begun, and questions about war crimes, reparations, and justice loomed large in international discourse for the women in the camp. Their fate was uncertain. Some feared being sent home to face suspicion or punishment by their own people, while others hoped for freedom and a chance to rebuild their lives in a shattered nation. Captain Stokes initiated conversations with relief organizations and Japanese Red Cross representatives to explore options for safe repatriation or resettlement. As the weeks passed, the women began to show signs of emotional strain, despite the relative safety of the camp. Nightmares and flashbacks haunted their sleep. Some refused to leave their cots for hours. Others cried silently at night. Some expressed guilt over surviving when so many around them had perished. These psychological wounds were difficult to treat with limited resources, but the presence of sympathetic nurses and the occasional visit from chaplains offered some comfort. The military doctors worked too, trained staff in basic counseling and encouraged patience and understanding. One particular story emerged about a young woman named Yuki, who had been separated from her family during the final battles and had walked for weeks through devastated villages. To reach the American lines, she initially refused to speak and would not eat, preferring to curl into a fetal position and rock herself for hours. Lieutenant Waller personally intervened, arranging for a Japanese-speaking nurse to spend time with her. And slowly she began to respond to kindness and the offer of a doll brought from the Red Cross to remind her of childhood. Eventually, Yuki was able to write a letter home through Sato, describing her experience and expressing hope for reunion. Meanwhile, logistical challenges persisted. The climate was hot and humid. The camp was prone to flooding during monsoon rains, and supplies were often delayed or lost in transit. The staff worked around the clock to maintain sanitation and prevent outbreaks of malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. One nurse recalled how during a particularly severe storm, the women helped to reinforce tents and distribute blankets, demonstrating resilience that surprised many of the American soldiers who had come to see them as fragile. Despite the hardships, bonds developed between some of the women and their guards, friendships born out of shared human moments of laughter and sorrow. These connections blurred the strict lines of prisoner and captor and brought moments of humanity in a context defined by conflict and trauma. The women spoke quietly among themselves about their futures, about family lost, and about the dreams they had carried before the war disrupted everything, though none spoke. Of the past battles in detail, the pain was evident in their eyes and the silence between words. One evening, as the sun set behind the jungle canopy, a group of women gathered near the edge of the camp. their figures silhouetted against the fading light. Hana began to hum a traditional song softly. Others joined in a whispering chorus, their voices fragile but persistent. The sound carried through the camp a reminder that even in captivity and despair, there remained a thread of identity culture and hope that could not be extinguished. Lieutenant Waller heard the melody from his post and paused to listen, moved by the resilience of those in his care and reminded of the humanity that war too often overshadowed. As the weeks turned into months, the Japanese female prisoners of war began to settle into the harsh rhythms of camp life, though the memory of violence and loss lingered heavily on their minds. The U.S. forces worked to maintain order and provide for their basic needs while also navigating the complex political and social realities of post-war occupation. Lieutenant Waller continued his oversight, making sure that the women were treated fairly and that their dignity was preserved as best as possible under difficult circumstances. Transfer to the larger facility in Manila was finally arranged, and on a humid morning the women were carefully packed into trucks with their belongings wrapped in bundles of cloth, some clutched tightly to photographs or letters given to them by the nurses. The journey was long and bumpy, winding through devastated towns and scarred landscapes. The women stared out of the windows quietly. Some whispered prayers or sang soft songs. Others remained silent, lost in thought. The sight of ruined buildings and smoldering debris was a stark reminder of the war that had changed their lives forever. Upon arrival at the Manila camp, they were greeted by a new group of American and Filipino staff and assigned to a spacious barracks with better facilities for medical care and recreation. The facility had a small library and a chapel, and efforts were made to create a more supportive environment to aid in recovery. The women were encouraged to participate in group activities including arts and crafts, writing, and light exercise, which provided a welcome distraction from the trauma they endured. Captain Stokes had begun working closely with psychologists and social workers to address the emotional wounds and trauma that many of the women carried. They held group sessions where the women could speak if they wished, or simply listen to the stories of others. Some began to open up, sharing memories of their families, their hopes and their fears, and slowly bonds of solidarity formed. Among the prisoners, the staff also arranged for visits from Japanese Red Cross officials and family members when possible, which helped to reconnect some women with the outside world. The camp routine was strict but humane, with set times for meals, medical checkups, rest, and educational programs that taught skills to help the women reintegrate into civilian life. After months of uncertainty, the women began to express cautious optimism about the future, though the pain of their experiences remained a constant shadow. On certain days, they would gather outside the barracks to watch the sunset or to share stories from home. Some of the younger women took to teaching English words to others, while a few older women shared traditional songs and dances, fostering a sense of cultural continuity. Despite these positive developments, there were ongoing challenges and tensions. The women faced discrimination and suspicion from some Japanese officials and citizens who viewed former POWs and those associated with the military in ambiguous or hostile terms. Some feared reprisal or ostracism upon returning home and questioned whether they would ever find acceptance or peace. The American staff worked to prepare them for these realities, while advocating for their protection and rights through international agencies and diplomatic channels. Lieutenant Waller found himself increasingly involved in these efforts, coordinating with Japanese government representatives, relief organizations, and the military chain of command. His reports highlighted the complex nature of the prisoners' lives, emphasizing the need for sensitivity and respect for their unique circumstances. He also documented their progress in health and morale, stressing that many were resilient and eager to rebuild their lives despite the losses they had suffered. One woman named Keiko, who had initially been withdrawn and fearful, began to emerge as a quiet leader among the group. Her calm demeanor and willingness To help others earned her the respect of both prisoners and staff. She organized sewing circles and educational sessions, and often acted as a liaison, conveying concerns and suggestions from the women to the American officers. Her presence brought a sense of stability and hope to many who were struggling with the emotional toll of captivity. The staff also focused on physical rehabilitation. Many women suffered from lingering injuries, malnutrition, and chronic illnesses that required ongoing medical attention. Physical therapists provided massages, exercises, and treatments to improve mobility and strength. A small garden was planted where the women could engage in light gardening, a therapeutic activity that also provided fresh vegetables for the camp kitchens. The sight of green plants growing in the dusty soil became a symbol of life and renewal for those confined within the barbed wire fences. Social activities, such as movie nights and musical performances organized by U.S. military entertainment groups, helped lift spirits and provided moments of normalcy. The women responded with curiosity and occasional laughter to the unfamiliar films and songs, though their appreciation was tempered by the ever-present awareness of their predicament. In quieter moments, they would write letters or keep journals, chronicling their thoughts, hopes, and fears, the act of writing serving as a cathartic outlet and a means to retain identity and dignity. Throughout this period, the larger geopolitical landscape continued to shift with the Allied occupation of Japan, expanding reforms and rebuilding efforts underway. Meanwhile, the plight of prisoners of war remained a sensitive topic, often overshadowed by political and military priorities. Yet the stories of these women persisted quietly as testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. One poignant episode involved a reunion arranged by the Red Cross between Hana and her younger brother, who had been stationed in northern Japan. He had survived the war and managed to locate her through international tracing services. The meeting was emotional and bittersweet. Hana had changed greatly physically and emotionally, but the embrace they shared was a testament to enduring family bonds despite the distance and hardship. Both expressed gratitude for the chance to reconnect and vowed to support one another in the uncertain times ahead. As the months passed, the women prepared for repatriation. Many expressed relief at the prospect of returning home, but also apprehension about the reception they would receive and the challenges of rebuilding their lives in a nation scarred by defeat and poverty. The American staff arranged for counseling sessions and practical training on reintegration, as well as coordinated with Japanese authorities to ensure that the women would receive necessary support upon their return on the eve of their departure. The women gathered in the camp courtyard under a sky filled with stars. Some sang traditional songs, others shared quiet prayers. Lieutenant Waller addressed them, offering words of encouragement and respect, emphasizing their strength and courage. He thanked them for their cooperation and resilience, acknowledging the hardships they had endured and expressing hope that peace would finally bring healing and new beginnings. The next day, trucks arrived to transport the women to the port where they would board ships bound for Japan. The farewells were marked by tears and embraces, heartfelt thanks exchanged between prisoners and guards, bonds forged in the crucible of captivity and care. The journey home was filled with mixed emotions, a complex blend of relief, sadness, fear, and hope as they crossed the waters back to the land they called home, but which had forever been changed by the war. Upon arrival in Japan, the women were greeted by a country both familiar and profoundly altered. The cities bore scars of firebombing and destruction, and the population was struggling with shortages of food shelter and basic necessities. The women disembarked quietly, many holding their bundles, close their faces, reflecting a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and apprehension. The government had arranged for temporary housing centers where returning prisoners could stay while their futures were determined. But the reality was harsher than anyone had anticipated. The women were transported to a reception center on the outskirts of Tokyo, where they underwent medical examinations and interviews designed to assess their health and document their experiences. The center was crowded and chaotic with long lines and limited resources, the staff overworked and the atmosphere tense, but the women remained patient and cooperative, many driven by a deep longing to reunite with family and reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Reuniting with family was a complicated process. Some women were fortunate enough to find relatives alive and waiting for them. The joy of reunion often tempered by the visible suffering endured by those left behind. Others discovered that their families had perished in bombings or starvation, leaving them adrift and alone. One woman named Yuki, who had been so fragile in captivity, was overwhelmed upon finding that her parents had died during the war. She was taken in by distant relatives who struggled themselves to care for her, but provided a safe place to begin healing. The social stigma attached to former prisoners and those associated with the military presented a significant challenge. The post-war Japanese society was rife with suspicion and resentment, and many returning women found themselves marginalized by their communities. Some faced accusations of collaboration or cowardice, while others were simply regarded as burdens in a country trying to recover from total defeat. Despite this, the women displayed remarkable resilience, often drawing on the solidarity formed during captivity to support one another through these hardships. Many turned to work as a means of survival and rebuilding. Their skills acquired during the war were often limited, but they found employment in factories, farms, or as domestic workers. The government and aid organizations offered vocational training programs designed to help them gain new skills for a peacetime economy. Some women took part in sewing cooperatives or craft workshops that provided small incomes and a sense of purpose, while others engaged in agricultural labor, often under difficult conditions. The psychological scars left by their experiences remained profound. Many women struggled with symptoms of trauma, including nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, and depression. Mental health resources were scarce and stigmatized in Japan at the time, meaning that few had access to professional help. Instead, they relied heavily on each other and on informal networks of support, often sharing stories and coping strategies in small groups or community gatherings. Religious faith and spiritual practices also played an important role, offering comfort and hope. The Japanese Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations continued to provide assistance, distributing food, clothing, and medical care, and facilitating communication with families abroad. Letters and packages from former allies and international relief agencies helped to alleviate some material needs, but emotional recovery was slower and more elusive. The women's stories were largely absent from public discourse, overshadowed by broader narratives of national defeat and reconstruction, yet within their communities, their experiences became quietly woven into the collective memory. In the years that followed, some women chose to tell their stories openly, contributing to early post-war discussions about the human cost of conflict. Others remained silent, their pain too raw or fearing repercussions. The process of reconciliation with the past was uneven and complex. The legacy of captivity and survival, a private burden carried by many, while the country moved forward, rebuilding infrastructure, institutions, and identities. A number of the women married and raised families, bringing with them the lessons of endurance and compassion learned during captivity. Their children grew up hearing fragments of their mothers' pasts, stories of hardship, but also of hope and strength. These personal histories helped to shape a more nuanced understanding of the war's impact beyond the battlefield, recognizing the suffering and resilience of those caught in its shadows. Lieutenant Waller and Captain Stokes kept in touch with some of the women through letters and occasional visits arranged by the Red Cross. The bonds formed in the camp endured beyond the war, their correspondence filled with updates, expressions of gratitude, and mutual respect serving as reminders of shared humanity transcending former enmity. These connections stood as testaments to the possibility of healing and reconciliation even after profound conflict. Reflecting on the experience years later, Waller wrote about the lessons learned, the importance of treating prisoners with dignity, and the recognition that compassion amid conflict is not weakness, but a crucial part of justice. The story of the Japanese female POWs, he noted, is a reminder that behind every statistic are individual lives marked by courage, suffering, and hope, a legacy that should inform future generations committed to peace. The legacy of these women is remembered in small memorials and oral histories preserved by families and communities. Their experiences continue to inspire efforts to acknowledge and address the full human consequences of war beyond national narratives and political agendas. They stand as witnesses to resilience and the enduring spirit of those who survived captivity and sought to rebuild lives in the aftermath of unimaginable hardship. Years passed, and the women who had survived captivity and the long journey home found themselves navigating the complex terrain of post-war Japan, a country rebuilding from ashes while grappling with the scars left by conflict. Their experiences as prisoners of war remained deeply personal, but the impact rippled through families, communities, and eventually the broader society. Though the initial years were marked by hardship, isolation, and uncertainty, over time, their stories began to emerge as part of a larger dialogue about resilience, memory, and reconciliation. Many of the women dedicated themselves to rebuilding not only their own lives, but also contributing to their communities. Some became advocates for peace, sharing testimonies about their captivity and the importance of humane treatment, even in times of war. Their voices helped to raise awareness about the suffering endured by civilians and non-combatants, broadening the understanding of war beyond traditional military narratives. Educational programs and peace organizations invited survivors to speak encouraging dialogue between generations about the consequences of violence and the value of compassion. Family ties that had been strained or broken during the war slowly mended with time.